The Vareth custodian authorities' lead vessel crossed the heliopause at 3:12 hours, station time. On a morning I was already awake. I had not slept well. I rarely did in the weeks before a contact event. Not because I was afraid. After 31 years in the Accord Legal Interpretation Division, fear of the work had long since been replaced by something closer to the tension a craftsman feels before picking up a tool he has spent a decade sharpening. Not fear. Readiness, pressed into a restlessness that made sleep feel like an indulgence. The Calith Deep Vault runs 3.4 kilometers beneath the surface of the Calith megacity. At that depth, you cannot feel the city above you, not the vibration of the transit rail, not the hum of the warship launch platforms, nothing. What you feel instead is the weight of the stone itself, and the particular quality of air that has been cycled through atmospheric processors long enough to lose any trace of the world it came from. Clean to the point of sterility, quiet to the point of ringing. I had worked in the vault for 19 years, and I had never stopped noticing the quality of that silence. I was at my station on Sublevel 4 when the first relay feed came in from the Accord Outer Monitoring Network. The feed was flagged Priority Amber, which was the classification we used for approach signatures that matched our standing watch files contacts we were expecting, whose nature we had already categorized, whose arrival we had prepared for. Priority Amber was not an emergency. It was a confirmation. It was the system saying, the thing we thought would happen is happening. The Vareth custodian authorities' lead vessel crossed the heliopause at 3:12. 14 additional vessels followed at intervals over the next 6 hours, spacing themselves in the formation pattern our deep-range monitoring arrays had been tracking for 11 days. 16 vessels total. Consistent with the arrival profile, our mathematicians had projected from their drive signatures when they first crossed the outer monitoring threshold at 38 AU, 22 days prior. I opened the Vareth custodian authority file on my terminal. It was a thick file. It had been building for 44,000 years. The seal had been placed on our system 47,000 years ago. Not all at once. It was a layered thing, encoded across 17 frequency bands in the deep space transmission substrate, inscribed in what the Vareth called Preservation Protocol Standard 11, a legal instrument they used to designate inhabited worlds as forbidden preserves. The protocol required them, under their own law, to return and assess the preserve's status at an interval not to exceed 50,000 years. They were coming back early. That had been noted in the file. The seal itself had not been particularly difficult to find. Our long-range signal analysis division had recovered it 44,000 years ago, when our monitoring network first became capable of reading the frequency bands the Vareth used. At that point, the seal was already 3,000 years old. Our analysts read it in its entirety within the first century. The Vareth had not encrypted it, because they had not imagined a species they designated as primitive class fauna would develop the tools to read it. The seal said, in Vareth legal standard, something approximating, this system has been designated a forbidden preserve under Preservation Protocol Standard 11 in perpetuity for the protection of its primitive and pre-sapient inhabitants. No registered entity under Vareth custodian authority jurisdiction may enter, harvest, or disturb this system. The inhabiting fauna are to remain undisturbed in their natural developmental state. Assessment review is mandated at intervals not to exceed 50,000 years. It called us fauna. I have spent most of my adult life working with alien legal documents. I have read texts that describe humanity in terms ranging from the dismissive to the actively hostile empires that filed us as a territorial acquisition, hive minds that encoded us as a resource vector, ancient administrative councils that classified us as a demographic rounding error in their census data. The Vareth seal was something different. The Vareth seal called us fauna with what I could only describe as genuine benevolence. They had genuinely believed they were protecting us. They had looked at our ancestors 47,000 years ago and seen something that needed shelter, not subjugation. They had drawn a line around our system and written, "These creatures deserve to grow without interference." The Accord's response, when the seal was first recovered and decoded, had been measured and deliberate. There was a period of approximately 40 years during which our scholars, legal interpreters, and the Accord Council itself simply read the Varath Custodian Authority's legal corpus, everything we could find, everything our monitoring arrays could pull from the frequency bands the Varath used for their administrative broadcasts. We gathered, we read, we understood the shape of their law. Then we began building the answer. The Accord Custodian Counter-Authority filing took 33,000 years to complete, not because we worked slowly, we did not. It took 33,000 years because the filing was 77 million pages long, and because every single page of it had to be grounded, sourced, and cited in Varath law. Not our law, theirs. We were not arguing against their framework. We were arguing from inside it, using their own precedents, their own preservation protocol amendments, their own judicial review standards, their own definitions of sapience, legal standing, and the conditions under which a forbidden preserve designation became void. The argument distilled, under Varath Preservation Protocol Standard 11, Subclause 7, a forbidden preserve designation was automatically voided upon the inhabiting fauna demonstrating evidence of sapient legal capacity, defined as the ability to read, comprehend, and formally respond to a legal instrument in its original encoding. The inhabiting fauna of this system had done exactly that. We had read their seal. We had comprehended it. We were formally responding to it. Under their own law, the designation was void, and had been void from the moment we transmitted our first response, which we had transmitted 43,900 years ago. At the moment, our Signal Analysis Division completed its initial reading, addressed to the Varath Custodian Authority's last known administrative frequency. They had not answered that transmission. They may not have received it. We had sent it regardless because the legal record required it. The filing was completed 11,000 years ago. It had been sitting in the vault ever since, ready to transmit the moment the Custodian Authority's vessels crossed into our system. I had spent 19 years in the vault working on the final 1,200 pages of it. The work was not glamorous. Anyone who imagines legal interpretation as dramatic work has not spent 19 years annotating Varath judicial review decisions from 90,000 years of precedent, cross-referencing subclause citations against the original protocol amendments, and verifying that every single citation in the counterargument chain was internally consistent. The work was slow, methodical, and required a level of sustained attention that, after the first decade, becomes something less like focus and more like a settled state of being. A kind of permanent deep-reading mode that follows you home at the end of every watch, into your meals, into the particular edge of sleeplessness that had put me at my terminal at 3:12 hours on this specific morning. I did not regret a day of it. That is not a sentiment one performs at 62. It is simply a thing you discover about yourself when the filing that your predecessors started 33,000 years ago and that you spent the last 19 years completing is finally transmitted, and you sit in the quiet of Sublevel 4 and feel the full weight of the thing that just happened. The relay feeds continued to update through the morning. The Varath fleet held its formation discipline well, 16 vessels, moving in a configuration that the Accord's Military Analysis Division recognized as Custodian Assessment Protocol Formation, which was, per the Varath administrative manuals we had been reading for 44,000 years, the standard approach pattern for a preserve management assessment. Not a war formation, not a retrieval formation. They were flying in the same configuration a wildlife manager might use approaching a nature reserve. Patient, organized, entirely certain of what they were going to find. I ate breakfast at my station. The relay feeds were calm. At 7:14, The monitoring arrays logged the Vareth lead vessel's automated preserve assessment beacon activating, a sub-frequency pulse that was, in essence, them announcing their approach in the administrative language of their own protocol. It was, I thought, a polite thing to do. They had not changed that part of their procedure in 47,000 years. The Accord Response Fleet had been in position for 19 years. That was the part of this job that civilians who toured the vault occasionally found difficult to understand. They imagined the response fleet scrambling when the Vareth drive signatures were first detected at 38 AU, rushing to position, calling in warships, a frantic mobilization. It was not like that. The Accord's Military Preparation Division had calculated, based on the Vareth Administrative Manual's assessment interval schedule, a probability distribution for the likely arrival window. The high probability window had opened 24 years ago and ran for another 11 years. The response fleet had been staged in the Kareth Deep asteroid shadow for the last 19 years. 287 vessels, 14 capital warships, 211 response-class cruisers, 62 scout intercept vessels, sitting quietly in the shadow of an asteroid at the inner edge of the approach corridor, dark running, waiting. The capital warships alone were each between 6 and 9 kilometers in length. The Accord's enduring patience, the fleet's senior capital vessel, had been holding position in that shadow for 14 of the 19 years, its crew rotating through 6-month cycles, its systems maintained to a standard that meant it could go from dark running to full active in under 4 minutes. The Military Preparation Division had been meticulous about that. The filing was the primary response, and we had always known it. But the filing answered a legal question, and legal questions require the context of reality to give them weight. The fleet was the context. The fleet was what made the counterargument something other than an academic exercise. The orbital defense ring had been fully operational for 6,000 years. The 16 Accord platforms that constituted the ring had been placed in the assessment corridor, specifically because the Vareth Administrative Manuals specified that custodian assessment vessels followed the standard approach corridor defined in Preservation Protocol Standard 11's geometric survey maps. We knew exactly which path they would take. We had placed 16 orbital platforms directly along that path, each one carrying a legal instrument broadcast array in addition to its standard defense load, because the protocol for this contact required us to transmit the counter authority filing the moment the custodian vessels crossed the inner system boundary at 1 AU. Each platform in the ring massed approximately 40 kilometers across its primary structural spine. The broadcast arrays were housed in a secondary spine that extended perpendicular to the main axis, giving each platform a distinctive cross shape that was visible from the surface on a clear night if you knew where to look. I had looked, in the years I'd worked in the vault. On the evenings I took the surface access lift up to clear my head. I knew exactly which points of light in the orbital band were ring platforms. I had thought about them often, about what they represented, about the 6,000 years of construction and maintenance that had put them there, about the thousands of people who had lived and worked on them without ever seeing what they were ultimately positioned to do. They were positioned to do one thing, to make sure that when the Vareth fleet arrived at 1 AU and our counter-authority transmission began, the signal came from every direction simultaneously and could not be missed. The first Vareth vessel crossed 1 AU at 11:03 hours. At 11:03 hours and 4 seconds, the orbital defense ring's broadcast arrays transmitted the Accord custodian counter-authority filing in its entirety, 77 million pages, Vareth legal standard encoding, priority registered under the Vareth Custodian Authority's own filing receipt protocol. The transmission took 6.2 seconds. I watched the confirmation light on my sub-level 4 terminal shift from amber to green at 11:03 and 10 seconds. The transmission had been received. The Vareth lead vessel's communication array had logged receipt. Under Vareth law, a priority-registered legal instrument could not be ignored, set aside, or processed on a delayed timeline. Receipt triggered a mandatory 72-hour review hold before any further action could be taken by the receiving party. The Vareth fleet stopped. Not dramatically. They did not scatter or reverse. They held their formation, reduced their approach velocity to 0, and simply stopped 16 vessels sitting at 0.94 AU, holding position in the approach corridor, surrounded on three sides by the Accord's orbital defense ring, and with the Accord response fleet's 287 vessels now moving out of the Kareth deep shadow behind them. Not aggressively. Calmly. Coming to their assigned intercept positions, running lights active, communications arrays broadcasting on standard Accord channels in Vareth legal standard encoding, identification, intentions, legal standing, everything by the book. The Kareth deep shadow maneuver was something we had practiced on the assumption that it would take the custodian fleet approximately 4 minutes to register the response fleet's emergence and process what they were seeing. Our timing calculations suggested they would have the counter-authority filings opening pages in preliminary review at roughly the same moment the fleet's size became apparent to their sensor arrays. We wanted those two pieces of information to arrive together: the filing and the fleet. The argument and the reality behind the argument. What it would look like from the Vareth lead vessel's observation deck, I had tried to imagine many times over my 19 years. 16 vessels arriving at what they believed was a forbidden preserve, their assessment beacon active, their preserve management protocols running, their expectations calibrated to 47,000 years of institutional certainty about what a sealed primitive world looked like. Then the transmission, 6 seconds of signal, 77 million pages, priority registered and impossible to not log. And then, from the shadow behind them, the emergence of 287 Accord warships in formation, their running lights on, their identification broadcasts clear and formal, offering no threat and making no aggressive maneuver, simply appearing and holding position and being exactly what they were. A fleet that had been waiting for 19 years. And behind all of it, if the Vareth lead vessel's observation systems were oriented sunward, the Calith megacity, 40 kilometers of interconnected urban superstructure along the Calith coastline, visible from 0.94 AU as a diffuse brightening on the Terminator line. Above it, if their resolution was good enough, the traffic of the Calith High Port Orbital Station, the maintenance transits of the Accord's in-system warship core, the 16 steady points of light that were the orbital defense ring platforms in their assigned orbital band. We had not been shy about what we built. It had never seemed necessary to hide it. The Vareth seal had not forbidden us from building. It had forbidden other registered entities under Vareth jurisdiction from disturbing us. We had simply built, for 47,000 years, right up to the edge of what our system could support, and the result was what you saw if you looked at our Terminator line from 0.94 AU with a good sensor array. I do not know what they thought when they first resolved it clearly. The hours between the transmission and the Vareth fleet's first response were the strange hours. There is a particular quality to waiting when the work is already done, not the waiting of uncertainty, but the waiting of receipt. We had filed our instrument. We had transmitted it by law. What came next was their move, and their move was constrained by their own protocol to a 72-hour review hold. There was nothing to do but monitor the relay feeds and let the process run. Sublevel 4 of the Calith Deep Vault is a long room, 40 meters by 12, lined with relay terminals and document processing stations, staffed around the clock by 12 interpreters on rotating watch. My station was at the north end, closest to the primary relay node. On a normal day, the room had the particular quality of concentrated quiet that comes from 12 people doing work that requires sustained attention, the occasional soft exchange, the muted chime of an incoming data packet, the sound of a stylus on a notation pad. On a contact event day, the quality was different, denser. Everyone in the room was aware of the same information at the same moment, and the silence had a texture to it, not tension exactly. Something more like the held breath before a machine you have spent years building is switched on for the first time. I had been in the vault for 7 contact events over my career. This was the one I had spent 19 years preparing for specifically. The other 6 had drawn on earlier, shorter filings events I had worked on as a junior interpreter, contributing sections, learning the architecture of the documents under senior colleagues who had since retired or died. For this event, I was the senior Accord legal interpreter of record. The counter-authority filing's final 1,200 pages carried my name on the authorship block, alongside the names of every interpreter who had worked on the final revision cycle over the last 400 years. My supervisor for most of my time in the vault had been Varen Dolan, who had run Sub-Level 4 for 22 years and who had told me, when I arrived as a junior interpreter at 43, that she expected to retire before the Varath contact event arrived. She had been right. She had retired 9 years ago, still healthy, to the coast in the Calith South residential districts, where she had told me she intended to spend her remaining years reading history that someone else had written and letting other people do the cross-referencing for a change. She had sent me a short message when the monitoring arrays first logged the Varath drive signatures at 38 AU. The message said, "Good. You're ready. Send me a relay when it's done." I intended to. I read for most of the afternoon. Not the filing. I had read that enough times that I could have recited sections from memory. I read the background materials. The Varath Administrative History, the Lineage of Preservation Protocol Standard 11 through its 17 amendments over the last 90,000 years. The case records of the 14 other systems the Varath had designated forbidden preserves over the same period. Of those 14, 9 had been reassessed and found unchanged, still primitive, still deserving their protected status, still unaware they had been catalogued. 4 had gone silent, the designated fauna either extinct or departed, the preserves now empty. 1 had been reclassified under conditions our analysts had studied carefully and found similar in mechanism, though not in scale, to our own counterargument. Ours would make 2. There was something in that number that stayed with me through the afternoon. 2 out of 15 designated forbidden preserves. 2 systems that had read the seal, answered it, and built the counterargument strong enough to dissolve the designation. I did not know what the other system had used as their primary legal mechanism, or how long their filing had taken, or what their world looked like when the Varath arrived to assess. What I knew was that they had done the same thing in their way that we had done in ours. Read the document, understood the framework, answered from inside it. I thought about the other 13. The 9 still sealed, still protected, still, as the Varath administrative records phrased it, in their natural developmental state. I wondered what they were doing right now, on those 13 worlds, on this specific morning while 16 Varath vessels held position at 0.94 AU and read the filing we had built. I wondered whether any of them had monitoring networks capable of reading the Varath frequency bands. I wondered whether, on any of those worlds, in some equivalent of a sub-level archive complex, someone was sitting at a terminal watching signal analysis feeds and beginning to understand, for the first time, what they were looking at. I hoped so. I did not know. I had no way of knowing, but I hoped. At 18:23 hours, the relay feeds logged a change in the Varath fleet's configuration. 3 of the 16 vessels had shifted position. The lead vessel and 2 of the escort class had moved ahead of the main formation, approximately 40,000 kilometers, and oriented their communication arrays toward Earth. Not a combat maneuver, a communication maneuver. They were separating a small delegation from the main body, positioning it for a cleaner transmission line. The Accord Surface Relay Division logged the communication request at 1841 hours. The Vareth were requesting a channel, in their own legal standard, using the Accord's own registered communication protocols, which meant they had found those protocols in the counter-authority filing, in the section I had written in year 19 of my work, specifically because I had anticipated that a custodian authority fleet would need to understand how to establish formal contact with an Accord-registered legal entity once they had processed the filing's opening argument. I had included a 7-page communication protocol guide in the filing's administrative appendices, written in plain Vareth legal standard, explaining exactly how to open a channel if they needed one. I had written it with the same care I had given every other page, methodical, precise, assuming nothing about the reader's familiarity with Accord communication standards. I had written that section as a courtesy, to make it easy for them when the time came to ask the question they were going to need to ask. The channel was approved by the Accord Surface Contact Division at 1903 hours. The transmission from the Vareth lead vessel arrived at 1917 hours. It was a single question. In Vareth legal standard, the question translated as, under what authority does the designated fauna party claim sapient legal standing, and by what mechanism does that standing supersede the originating custodial instrument? It was, as legal questions went, precise. It went directly to the core of the counter-authority filing's argument, to the operative mechanism, the hinge point on which the entire 77 million-page structure turned. It was asking us to explain, in summary, the argument that the filing made in full. It was a fair question. It was exactly the question I would have asked in their position, after spending 6 hours reading the opening sections of a filing 77 million pages long. I had written the answer to that question 11,000 years ago. The Accord Surface Contact Division forwarded the question to Sublevel 4 at 1921 hours. I had been waiting at my terminal since 1903. I pulled up the answer summary from the filing archive, a 340-page condensed argument brief, pre-translated into Vareth legal standard, pre-formatted for priority registered response, and reviewed it one final time. It took me 40 minutes. The answer brief contained 4 operative arguments. The first, under Vareth Preservation Protocol Standard 11, Subclause 7, a forbidden preserve designation was automatically voided upon demonstration of sapient legal capacity by the inhabiting fauna, defined in the protocol's own language as the ability to read, comprehend, and formally respond to a legal instrument in its original encoding. We had read the seal. We had comprehended it. We had formally responded to it, 43,900 years ago, in its original encoding, addressed to the Vareth custodian authority's last known administrative frequency. That response constituted the triggering event under Subclause 7. The second operative argument, our response transmission 43,900 years ago, regardless of whether it was received, constituted formal notification under Subclause 7's notification requirement. The Vareth Protocol required the custodian authority to acknowledge such a notification within 1,000 years. The absence of acknowledgement within that window constituted, under Vareth Judicial Review Standard Keyleth 9, a precedent we had found in their own records, 27,000 years old, applied in an administrative dispute between 2 custodian suboffices, constructive acceptance of the void. The forbidden preserve designation had been constructively void for 42,900 years. We were not arguing that it should be voided today. We were arguing that it had been void for most of recorded Accord history, and that the Vareth custodian authority's failure to acknowledge our response notification was the operative mechanism that had sealed that void into legal fact under their own standards. The third, the 77 million-page filing itself, constituted the formal legal instrument of standing required under Preservation Protocol Standard 11's review procedure. Citing 4,400 Vareth precedents, 312 Varath judicial review decisions, and 17 protocol amendments, all sourced from Varath administrative records, all authenticated against the Varath custodian authorities' own archive checksums, all cited in their original Varath legal standard encoding with full reference notation. We had not written the filing in our legal language and asked them to accept it. We had written it in their legal language, from their records, citing their precedents, using their review standards. They could not dispute the citations without disputing their own administrative archive. The fourth, and the one I had spent the most time on, under the Varath custodian authority's own definition of sapient legal standing, the capacity to read, comprehend, act upon, and formally contest a legal instrument, the designated fauna party of this system had met every criterion 44 centuries ago. Not today, 44 centuries ago. The void was not a claim we were making at this contact event. It was a historical fact, legally operative for millennia before the custodian authorities' vessels entered our system. Their arrival did not create the void. It merely provided them the opportunity to formally acknowledge a void that had existed since long before anyone currently alive had been born. We transmitted the answer brief at 2001 hours. 340 pages, priority registered, Varath legal standard encoding. It reached the Varath lead vessel's communication array at 2001 hours and 11 seconds. Then we waited again. The deep hours of the night in sublevel 4 have a particular texture that is different from the daytime hours. The staff changes on the night rotation, different faces, quieter exchanges, the same relay terminals and document stations under the same recycled light. I stayed at my station past the watch change. My deputy, Karen Solith, offered me a cot in the back room at 100 hours. I told him I would take it in a few hours. I did not. I sat at my terminal and drank the bitter standard issue tea that the vault's processors produced in quantity, and thought about the 44,000 years of work that had gone into the documents we had just transmitted. I thought about the first analyst who had pulled the seal out of the frequency band noise 44,000 years ago and read it and understood what it was. I did not know her name. It was that long ago, and the historical record from that period was incomplete in many places, because humanity at 44,000 years ago was not yet the civilization that built archives for everything. The Accord itself was younger than the seal when the seal was found. The legal interpretation division that I now ran had not existed. The vault had not existed. The monitoring network that had found the seal had been a fraction of the size and capability of the network we ran today. Everything we had become, the vault, the filing, the response fleet in the Kareth Deep Shadow, the Ring's broadcast arrays, the 340-page answer brief I had transmitted that evening, had grown out of that first reading, that first moment of comprehension, that first decision to respond. One person, or a small group, reading a document that had been placed in the signal substrate of our system to keep other entities out and to keep us unknowing inside it. Reading it and understanding what it was and making the decision, which was not one decision but many decisions over many years, none of them dramatic, all of them cumulative, to not simply know what the seal said, but to build the answer to it. I thought about the 411,000 individual contributors listed in the filing's authorship registry. Legal interpreters, historians, astronomers, linguists, mathematicians, archivists, military legal advisors, protocol specialists, generations of them, spanning 33,000 years. None of them had lived to see this morning. The vast majority of them had worked on the filing in the understanding that they would never see it transmitted, never see the Varath fleet stopped at 0.94 AU reading it, never receive the acknowledgement that their 33,000 years of work had produced. They had done the work because it was the right work to do, because the generation before them had handed it to them as the most important thing in progress, and because they intended to hand it to the generation that came after them in better shape than they had received it. That was the chain. That was the thing that a 33,000-year project required in order to be possible at all. A chain of people who understood that the work was longer than any life, and who did their part of it without needing to see the end. Patience, memory, preparation. Those were not slogans. They were not the motto on a shield or the text of a founding document. They were the lived experience of 411,000 people who had each done a fraction of a thing too large for any one of them, and who had trusted the chain to hold. The Varath fleet's response came through at 7:14 hours the following morning, 19 hours after we transmitted the answer brief. 19 hours to read a 340-page condensed argument brief built on 77 million pages of their own law. I had expected they might need the full 72 hours, or at least 48. 19 hours told me they were thorough readers, or that they had good legal staff aboard, or both. It was not another question. The transmission was a formal legal acknowledgement, in Varath legal standard, priority registered under the same filing protocols they had used for their initial question. The acknowledgement registered receipt of the Accord Custodian Counter-Authority filing. It registered receipt of the answer brief. It registered, formally and without qualification, the Varath Custodian Authority's notation that the designated fauna party's legal argument under Varath Preservation Protocol Standard 11, Subclause 7 had been reviewed, processed, and taken under judicial consideration. And then it said something I had not anticipated, despite 19 years of preparation and 44,000 years of institutional history behind me. In Varath legal standard, the language was precise and formal. But the translation my terminal produced, which I read 3 times to be certain I had it correctly, said, in essence, the custodian authority acknowledges that the applicable legal instrument was found, read, and responded to in correct form. The custodian authority further acknowledges that the notification of void was transmitted within the required window, and that the absence of acknowledgement within the mandated response period constitutes, under applicable review standards, constructive acceptance. The designation is void. This authority records its formal recognition of the opposing party's sapient legal standing, retroactive to the date of first formal response, 43,900 years prior to this contact event. This authority has no further claim upon this system. Then the lead vessel's communication array went dark. At 8:31 hours, the Varath fleet began maneuvering, all 16 vessels, coordinated, turning in the approach corridor to orient their drives for outward transit. Not the emergency scatter of a formation under fire, not the reluctant withdrawal of a force that had been militarily compelled to leave. The measured, unhurried movement of ships that had somewhere else to be. I watched the relay feeds. I did not speak for a while. Karen Solith came to stand beside my station at approximately 8:45 hours. He had been in sublevel 4 for the night and morning watch, and he looked as tired as I felt, but he had the same quality of alertness that the rest of us had, that particular wakefulness that comes from caring too much about something to let tiredness win. He read the relay feed on my terminal and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's it then." I said, "That's it." He said, 19 hours. I thought they might take the full 72. I said, they only needed to check 4 points of law and confirm that they were binding. 19 hours is about right for a fleet that has just discovered their preserves fauna, built a 33,000-year legal counterargument, and was waiting for them with 287 warships in the next shadow over. Karen smiled at that briefly, then he said, "Do you think they'll come back?" I thought about that. The Varath Custodian Authority had been cataloging forbidden preserves for at least 90,000 years. They had 14 other active preserves, by the last count in their administrative records. They had a structure, a purpose, a legal and bureaucratic identity that was built around the act of stewardship, around the idea that they were the ones who decided what warranted protection, what qualified as fauna, what deserved the shelter of their seal. We had just told them, with 77 million pages of their own law, that their mechanism was voided, that one of the things they had sealed away and called fauna had read the seal, answered it, and spent 44 millennia building the legal, military, and intellectual infrastructure to prove the point. The Accord's enduring patience and 286 other vessels had come out of the shadow behind them and held position while they read. The orbital defense ring had held its configuration the entire time, 16 platforms in their orbital band, each 140 kilometers across its primary spine. I said, I think they'll go away and read the filing for a very long time, all 77 million pages of it. And I think that, when they are done reading it, they will have a number of difficult conversations about the other 14 preserves. Karen nodded. He understood what I meant. If the mechanism we had demonstrated worked here, reading the seal, answering it from inside its own framework, then the mechanism was available to any of the other 14 designated systems if they were far enough along to find the seal and read it. The Varath Custodian Authority would know that now. Whether they filed amended protocols, or changed their sealing procedures, or did something else entirely, I could not predict. But they would not leave those 14 files untouched. Karen walked back to his station. I stayed at mine. By 11:30 hours, the Varath fleet had completed its outbound transit alignment and begun accelerating toward the heliopause. The Accord response fleet held position in the Kareth deep shadow, not pursuing, not intercepting, not broadcasting anything further. The orbital defense ring held its operational configuration but stood down from active tracking. The channels remained open. Nothing more was needed. I filed the contact event record at 13:40 hours. It was a long document, not as long as the counter-authority filing but substantial. It recorded the approach timeline, the transmission events, the receipt confirmations, the exchange of question and answer, the withdrawal. It recorded the Varath fleet's formal acknowledgement and the date of the void's retroactive recognition. It recorded the response fleet's deployment and stand-down. It noted, in the summary section, that no hostile action had been taken by either party and that no personnel casualties had occurred on any side. Near the end, in the summary section, I wrote, the Accord Custodian Counter-Authority filing performed as designed. The legal mechanism argued therein was accepted by the opposing party without contest. No hostile engagement occurred. No casualties. The forbidden preserve designation is dissolved as of the date of first formal response, retroactively recognized as 43,900 years prior to this contact event. Contact closed. That was accurate. Those were the facts. I read them back to myself in the quiet of Sublevel 4, under the 3.4 kilometers of stone and megacity above me, and I thought about the word dissolved. It was a good word for it. The seal had not been broken. It had not been fought through or burned away. It had been read, comprehended, answered, and outgrown, over so many generations that the generation who finally received the acknowledgement was as far removed from the generation that first found the seal as we were from the ancestors the Varath had looked at 47,000 years ago and called fauna. We had dissolved the seal from the inside, one page at a time, over 44,000 years. At 1500 hours, I filed the contact event record to the Accord Central Archive and sent a relay message to Varen Dolan, who was retired on the coast in the Calith South residential districts. The message said, filing performed, fleet withdrew, void recognized, contact closed, no casualties. Her reply came back 40 minutes later, which told me she had been waiting for it. It said, good, now write the history. I smiled at that in the quiet of Sublevel 4. Then I closed the contact event file, opened a new document, and began to do exactly that. But first I took the lift up. The Calith megacity at 1600 hours in late afternoon had a particular quality of light. The sun angled low enough to catch the upper tiers of the tower network, and bounce it sideways across the Caliph Bay, turning the water a deep amber. I came up through the surface access and stepped onto the upper terrace of the vault's transit hub and stood in that light for a moment and simply looked. The Caliph megacity ran 40 kilometers along the coast. It had been building for 30,000 years. The oldest structures at its center, the founding quarter, the Accord Remembrance Hall, the first generation of transit nodes, had been incorporated into the base layers of towers that now ran 6 kilometers above them, and those towers had been built over by bridges and platforms and secondary structures, until the city had achieved a kind of layered density that was less like a skyline and more like a geological formation. Ancient at the base, continually renewed at the top, everything in between in the process of becoming something else. Above the towers, in the late afternoon sky, 2 Accord cruisers were running a standard transit across the northern quadrant. They were each approximately 800 meters in length, which meant they were large enough to see clearly from the terrace as distinct shapes, angular, functional, their hull plating catching the afternoon sun. They were part of the in-system core, not the Karath Deep Fleet. The Karath Deep Fleet was still at position. It would take another 48 hours for the stand-down order to cycle through. The orbital defense ring platforms were not visible in the afternoon glare, but I knew exactly where they were. 16 positions in the orbital band, each one holding its station with the same patience it had held for 6,000 years. The contact event had lasted less than 30 hours from first transmission to fleet withdrawal. The ring had been there for 6,000 years waiting for 30 hours. That seemed, to me, like an accurate representation of what this project had always been. I stood on the terrace for a while. The air was cold off the bay and smelled of salt and the particular mineral tang that the coastal processing units left in the wind. It was not an unpleasant smell. After 19 years of recycled sublevel air, it was a very specific pleasure. I thought about the Varath Custodian Authority's 16 vessels, somewhere past the heliopause now, moving outbound with their formal acknowledgement and their 77 million pages of counterargument. And whatever conclusions a fleet of preserve management administrators drew when they discovered that their oldest and most confidently sealed preserve had, in the intervening period, become something that put 287 warships in a shadow and waited for them with a filing built from their own law. I did not feel triumphant about that exactly. Triumph was not quite the word for what I felt on the terrace in the late afternoon light. What I felt was something closer to completion, the particular quality of a thing finished after a very long time, not the quick satisfaction of a task well done. The slower, heavier satisfaction of a chain held for 44 millennia, finally coming to rest at its intended end. They had called us fauna. We had read the seal they left behind. We had spent 44,000 years building the answer. We had transmitted the answer in 6.2 seconds, and they had read it and they had written back. The designation is void. You were never what we thought you were. We have no further claim. That was all. That was the thing that had taken 44,000 years to say. It was not a dramatic thing to say. It was not the kind of ending that gets remembered in songs. It was the kind of ending that gets filed in the Accord Central Archive and summarized in 4 lines of contact event record language. But it was the right ending for the kind of work it had been. Patient, methodical, grounded, exact. The work of a civilization that had decided, 44,000 years ago, that the correct response to a seal placed around you was to read it carefully and to understand it so thoroughly that by the time the sealers came back, you had already been free for longer than most galactic administrative histories ran. I went back inside. In Sublevel 4, I opened the new document and began at the beginning, which was 47,000 years ago, when a fleet of Varath Custodian Authority vessels arrived in our system and looked at our ancestors and saw something that deserved to be protected. They had not been wrong about what they saw. Our ancestors, at that moment, had needed protection. They had been early and fragile and still learning. The Vareth had looked at them and seen the truth of that moment and had drawn their line with genuine care. They had been wrong about one thing only. They had assumed that a species needing protection in the moment was a species that would always need it. They had sealed the preserve, written the protocol, filed the instrument, and left it confident that 50,000 years would find things much as they left them. 44,000 years ago, someone pulled the seal out of the signal noise and read it. I do not know her name. The record is incomplete. But I know what she understood in the moment she finished reading, that the Vareth had not understood when they wrote it, that the fauna they had come to protect were already reading, that the thing they had drawn their line around was already thinking, already building, already reaching, in ways that were still fragile and early and partial, but real toward the kind of civilization that would, in time, build the tools to find the seal, and the will to answer it. She could not have known what the answer would cost. She could not have known it would take 33,000 years to build, or run to 77 million pages, or carry 411,000 names. She could not have known about Sublevel 4, or the Kareth Deep Shadow, or the Orbital Defense Ring's 16 platforms in their 6,000-year orbital station. She knew none of that. She knew only what was in front of her, a document that said she was fauna, written by a people who had meant it as kindness. And she decided to write back. That was the beginning. Everything else, the 33,000 years, the filing, the fleet, the 6.2-second transmission, the 19 hours, the acknowledgement, was preparation for the moment when the writers of the seal came back and found out that the thing they had sealed was not what they thought it was, had never been what they thought it was, not since the moment someone first sat down to answer. I wrote through the night. By 300 hours the following morning I had 60 pages, and the beginning was clear, and the chain of it was intact from the first reading to the last acknowledgement, and I could see the full shape of it now. 44,000 years of human work, accumulated in the dark behind a seal, invisible to the people who had placed it there, growing and growing and growing until the day the seal came open, and what poured out was not the primitive fauna that had been protected, but the civilization that had read its own cage and answered it. I saved the 60 pages, shut down my terminal, and walked to the back room and took the cot Karen had offered me 14 hours before. The vault was quiet, the relay feeds were calm. The Vareth fleet was past the heliopause and moving outbound toward whatever they were going to do next, carrying a void that had been building for 44,000 years. I slept without difficulty for the first time in weeks. Some things end exactly as they should. We had been ready for this one for 44,000 years. We had never stopped being ready. That, in the end, was the only thing that had ever needed to be true.